Sometimes we try so hard to get something right that we actually lose sight of what it is that we set out to do in the first place. And I think it's because of our intensity of overthinking and sometimes just overanalyzing and projecting into what it is that's potentially going to come out of what we're trying to do. How we want it to be received, how we want it to be acknowledged or celebrated, whatever it is. It's all of that overthinking about what next that causes us to overdo what we're doing now. And I think in that there's a lot of wisdom. I think in that there's a lot of insight that allows us to be able to reconsider what it is that we apply ourselves towards, how it is that we exert ourselves. Because when we lose sight of what we wanted to achieve in the first place, what happens then is that we actually create a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies and a lot of undue stress and strain as a result of it, because we end up wanting to get something perfect on the first pass. We end up trying to knock the lights out on our first attempt. And a client of mine, mentioned to me once, and it stuck with me. It says that you start out weak, but you end strong. And that's something that I needed to remind myself of about these podcasts as well, because my intention behind the podcast was always to have just a topical, relevant conversation about what it is that we struggle with in the mental health domain. And I say mental health domain, but mental health is very much about being human. And that's, for me, the biggest difficulty right there, is that we seem to have forgotten that there's a point of humanity that we're supposed to be connecting with rather than illnesses. And that's why I'm so militant in many ways about my views about mainstream mental health, because I think we've forgotten that. I think we've lost sight of the human in such a profound way that even us as humans, trying to operate as humans, we've even lost sight of ourselves in that way. We look at ourselves as a bunch of symptoms or a bunch of trophies or a bunch of awards or milestones that others would celebrate or admire or respect. And that's sad. It's really sad, because we lose sight of the very essence of who we are and why it is that any of this matters. The people around us, they don't connect with us anymore because of the way it is that we make ourselves available, and we don't connect with them as much as we should because we're looking at them through our lenses and our filters, and then we're blaming and blaming and blaming, and it just doesn't stop. And in our struggle for agency, and that's a struggle that we all have, even though we don't know we're struggling for it, right? But agency is effectively our need and our right and our ability to choose our response to life, choose what we want from life, choose how it is that we're going to deal with what life throws at us, including choosing what we think and how we feel about what someone else thinks of us and feels about us. And when we lose sight of that agency, we become driven by fear. We become driven by fear because there's always threats to our existence, threats to our well-being, threats to our relevance, and especially threats to our ability to take care of those that we have around us, who rely on us, who depend on us. And all of those threats shape eventually how it is that we show up. It shapes it because everything becomes driven by fear. And then in our efforts to reduce the impact of that fear, we choose outlets and we choose ways of dealing with it. And we choose recreational activities and the like. That is not necessarily wholesome or doesn't feed the soul, doesn't replenish us, it doesn't refuel us, it just gives us pause. And that pause is where things get lost, I think. When we pause, we don't decompress. We just catch our breath. And everything that we were fighting with up until that point, everything that we were struggling with and pushing for, we just kind of like take a moment of reflection to gather our thoughts and gather our energy about what it is that we have on our plate, and then we push forward again. And that isn't sustainable, because we're not offloading. The only time anything gets offloaded is if we successfully tick a box to say it's been dealt with, or it's been mitigated or achieved, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. But for the things, and for the larger part of it, I think there's a whole lot of things that accumulate, keeps building up. Because as we go through life, the more aware we become, the more responsible we become, the more we become driven by all of the opportunities and all of the things that we want to be able to achieve and contribute towards. And that creates expectations, right? It creates expectations with a lot of the people around us, because rightfully so, we raised their expectations. And then when we raise their expectations without realizing that we didn't exactly communicate how it is that we feel about it, or how it is that we want them to be able to receive it or support us in it and things like that, everyone then generally starts operating with expectation that if I'm doing this, then because you know that you're benefiting from what I'm doing, then I would expect you to respond in a certain way. And if you don't respond in the way that I expect you to respond, then that tells me something. And what it tells me is going to be based on my own suspicions, my own understanding, my awareness, or even my insecurities. And then again, we go back into that fear mode about how it is that we need to demand our significance. And then the rage comes out again. And there's so much of rage. Rage is so deeply entrenched in so much of what we do that I don't think most of us even realize that we operate on anger most of the time. And I know this sounds like a sweeping generalization, and maybe I'm just in a kind of reflective, introspective, morbid space, or I don't know, whatever it might be. But the point is that when I look around me and I look at how much of people's behavior is driven by anger, I can see the signs clearly. But it's not on the surface, because on the surface it looks like we're okay. And for the most part, on the surface, we are okay, right? Until we're not. But by that point, it's because what was bubbling beneath the surface eventually just took over. So what's bubbling beneath the surface, I believe, is only revealed when we're challenged, when something doesn't go our way, or when we feel disrespected or undermined or irrelevant. And that's when we see exactly what's bubbling beneath the surface. And when we see it bubbling beneath the surface, what comes up, the rage, the anger, the depression, the anxiety, whatever it is that we feel, because we're focused on whether or not we're justified to feel that way, we don't stop to consider why it is that we feel such intensity. It's one thing to feel disappointed or to feel let down. It's another thing to feel enraged about the fact that you were disappointed to the point of feeling betrayed. And then everything starts feeling like betrayal, right? Whatever we need from people, if we have reason to believe that they understand that we need that from them, if they don't deliver on it, automatically from our side, it feels like betrayal. Because you knew I was expecting that, you know how I like this, you know I like when you do something like that. So now that you're not doing it anymore, that trust that I placed in you, that feels like betrayal. But I don't internalize it as betrayal. I just internalize it as hurt, as insignificance, as not being good enough. And when I internalize it like that, that's what's going to determine how it is that I react the next time I feel that way again. And that's what we lose sight of. We're so fixated on wanting to label people and label behaviors that we lose sight of the fact that there's that simple mechanics, that simple interaction that's going on beneath the surface that influences a lot of our behavior and how we show up for others. How we show up for ourselves, especially. Because how we show up for ourselves is a major contributing factor to what it is that we need and expect from others. And that's what we don't get. We lose sight of that because, again, the labels are such an unfortunate distraction. And then people take exception to me when I challenge the norms about the labels, but perhaps I should change my tact, and perhaps we should focus on why it is, not just the intellectual why or the academic why of the labels, but what it is about labels that is so infuriating that if we challenge something that someone subscribes to, that they automatically go off on a tangent and are enraged and threaten you with consequences and threaten you with all sorts of things. Rage is a demand for significance. It's a demand that we want our struggle and our emotional needs to be recognized. That's why we rage. It's a communication, right? I said it in a couple of episodes ago and I'll say it again. I believe that anger and rage is a way of communicating exactly how strongly we feel about something. And in the absence of any other recourse that we believe will be effective, we then rely on that to get our point across. And that's how we then become focused on what respect looks like, on what significance looks like. It's then, if that becomes our preferred communication because we have no reason to believe that someone is going to take us seriously without that rage being expressed, then automatically rage becomes our go-to. It becomes our default. And then we don't communicate as raging all the time because then you won't be taken seriously, right? So you have to have variations of it. And those variations will be things like just being very stern, being very intent and intense in the way you communicate, where there's an implied consequence if you don't comply, if there's an implied consequence if you don't take me seriously and things like that. And that's also a form of rage. And it's that impatience and that intolerance that comes into our communication and the way we deal with each other, that in itself carries anger with it, because we're cutting people short because we don't want them to even think they can go there. We don't want people to even think that they can assume to treat us a certain way, so we'll immediately preemptively just shut it down. And that's how it is that we don't create space for understanding or space for people to just see each other. Everything comes down to the transaction in that moment. I need this, it's my right, it's my legitimate claim, so you will. No questions asked, no, I'm not interested in any excuses from you. And vice versa, right? And that's why it's not a gender-based thing. As much as we want to believe that a lot of these mental illnesses and anger and rage and violence and things like that are gender-based, it's not. We just exact that kind of anger and violence and retribution in different ways, but it's still there. And because men and women are different by nature, the way they experience it from each other is experienced in exactly the same way emotionally. So we need to be careful about almost genderizing, if that's even a word, the whole mental health space. We also need to be careful about trying to position strengths of character to be specific to a gender, especially when it comes to failed relationships and that, because that happens a lot. We have a lot of content going out there that talks about how a good woman is like this and a good man is like that. No, a good person is like that. A good person owns what it is that they bring to the table. A good person owns how it is that they see them making others feel, and then they choose whether they want to do something about it or not. It's not about whether or not you have a right to, or whether it's not your problem or not, because that's what happens. I think if you look at it, everything these days is about whether it's your problem or not, and that determination about whether it's your problem or not is whether or not there's going to be consequences if you don't do something about it, or if you don't accept responsibility for it, or if and those consequences are primarily whether there's legal obligation to do it. And legal obligation is not just secular law, it's not just the law of the state or the country you're in, but it's also law of the religion that you follow. So religiously, do I subscribe to that? Yes, I do. So if I don't, then what are the consequences according to religion? And then we go on that route and we determine whether we're willing to deal with those consequences, or whether we think we have an argument that can mitigate why it is that we don't qualify for those consequences. And all of this, coming back to the original point, is just loses sight of the human. And that's why we've got religion that's center stage. We've got caste systems and ethnicity and racism that takes center stage, and classism about wealth and social standing and academic prominence and things like that. we become so enamored by what it is that we're offering that we don't realize that we're still human behind all of that. And if you take that away, if you take away what we're offering, if you take away what we have, what are you left with? Are you left with someone that you respect? Are you left with someone that you appreciate? And I'm talking of us for ourselves, not just the people that we're looking at, because that's another thing, is that we're always directing our focus and our attention and our judgment and our evaluation and assessment and all of those things. We're always focusing it on the next person. Very seldom do we introspect and hold ourselves accountable. So one of the challenges I've always tried to maintain, not successfully for the most part, but I'm still trying, is to hold myself to the same standard that I hold others. So if I expect other people to be responsible in a certain way, I try my hardest to ensure that I come to the table with the same level of responsibility, at least, if not more. And similarly with everything else about being human, about being a person, about adulting and all of those things, is that if we want to receive a certain amount of understanding, are we willing to offer that level of understanding? If we want others to make sacrifices for us, are we willing to make similar sacrifices for them? Or do we rely on rights and responsibilities to avoid such sacrifices, so that we don't have to make the sacrifice because we were entitled to what it is that we asked them for in the first place, or what we expected from them, or what was due from them? And it's that entitlement again that comes back to the thing that feeds your rage. Because when you have an expectation of someone, it means that you believe that you are entitled, you have a right to whatever it is you expect from them. If you didn't believe that, then you wouldn't actually expect it from them in the first place, right? So that's kind of, I don't think that's really open for debate. It's really something that's quite straightforward. If I expect you to do something, that means that I believe I'm entitled to you doing it. And I've also believe that it's your responsibility to do it, and I believe it's my right to expect that of you to do it. All of those sorts of things play into it. So what I said earlier about betrayal, when someone doesn't fulfill that expectation of yours, it feels like betrayal, because the entitlement means there's a trust. I trust that you will do this because you have to honor the rights that I have over you. And then when that right is not fulfilled, it feels like betrayal of trust. And the betrayal of trust means that I'm not as important as I'm supposed to be, or as important as I should be, or as important as I thought I was. And when I'm not as important as all that, then I'm either going to walk away if it's not an important relationship, or I'm going to fight for significance. But it gets worse, right? Because remember, we're not offloading. We're just ticking boxes when things are complete and attended to, and that's it. So when something is not complete and not attended to, or out of our control to resolve, and it's not critically important, but it's also something that we do have a fairly strong view on, that's the stuff we then tend to park. It goes in the back of our mind, and that becomes, okay, I didn't get it. I didn't get that. I didn't get that. I didn't get that. And then it goes on and on and on. And we start keeping a tally in the back of our mind without meaning to. And eventually we get tired of not getting things that are due to us, because we always, in our mind, they say we're all legends in our own mind. So in our mind, we believe we're doing right as best as we can by the people around us. So when we work with that assumption that we're doing the right as best as we can to the people around us, we don't look at the as best as we can part when we see whether they're doing right by us or not. Because we're driven by fear of being insignificant or inconsequential. We're driven by the fear of being let down again, or being betrayed, or people not having our back for us. And then that influences the way it is that we show up. It influences how it is that we interpret other people's efforts towards us. More importantly, it also influences how we expect them to show up relative to what we need from them, rather than how they may already be showing up for us in a different way, relative to who they are, relative to what they're capable of. And that's the thing I was talking about when I said that we rarely hold ourselves to the same standard as we hold others. Because when we rage into safe spaces. We rage into spaces where we know that the repercussions are something that we are willing to accept. If we're not willing to accept it, we'll find a way to control ourselves. And that's why I continue to maintain that rage and anger is not an emotion in itself. It's a means of communicating your emotional intensity about a certain matter. Because you can subdue your rage. But if you're disappointed about something, and you know that that disappointment is not going to be appreciated, you don't stop being disappointed. You don't restrain your disappointment. You just don't express it. You just don't share it because you don't think it's going to be appreciated. Or you don't think anyone's going to understand, or you think it might be used against you. So same with depression and anxiety and all of these other things. What we feel on the inside, that internal instinctive reaction to something that happens, that's our emotions. And we have good reason relative to the canvas of our life. We have good reason to feel that way. And now someone's coming along and telling us, well, not just someone, but tons of people coming along and telling us how we're supposed to feel. If you feel this way, then there's something wrong with you because you're not supposed to feel that way. So that means you need something to get you right. And that automatically strips you of agency, and it also denies you credibility because now someone else comes along and they say, hey, you suffering from that illness, that mental illness. So that means that I have to take what you say with a pinch of salt. I have to, manage my expectations around you because you can't be reliable if you're struggling with that. And that's why then it becomes a matter of confidentiality. And we just end up spiraling and rabbit holing down into deeper and darker spaces because of that way of thinking. And that's another problem that comes into play when we talk about the mainstream mental health view on mental illness. And there's one very uncomfortable perspective that people tend to avoid when it comes to this. And it's a simple one. It's that if I believe that you suffer from a mental illness or mental disorder, because we've got personality disorders coming out of our ears these days, right? And I'm sure there's probably a disorder name for what I just said, that if you think that there's too many mental disorders, then there's probably something wrong with you as well. Who knows? Point is, if we say that someone is suffering from a mental illness or personality disorder, my question is, where does our empathy go to then? If someone is struggling with diabetes, do we write them off as a human? If someone is struggling with cancer, they're suffering from cancer, or someone's suffering from any number of illnesses or ailments or physical disabilities, we don't write them off. We adapt around them, or we understand, or we show empathy and compassion depending on the situation. Right? We have society bending over to make sure that those who are not as able-bodied are accommodated and have the ability to be able to have access to spaces that they should rightfully have access to. So we do all of that, right? But when it comes to mental disorders, and I'm saying disorders with a very heavy heart because I honestly believe that we diminish the human when we talk about it in that way. But when it comes to that, there's some of it that we want to show sympathy for, which is the ones that we think weakens us, right? So things like depression, anxiety, despondency, those sorts of emotions that we experience that's associated with some or other thing like social anxiety disorder and things like that. All of those things that lead to our insecurities that show up in a form that makes us appear meek or weak. For those, you'll find a number of people that are willing to be sympathetic and empathetic and willing to offer support. But the same source that defines those as disorders or as illnesses, when they define other things like narcissism, which is a trigger word for many people, when they define that as an example, as a disorder or mental illness, why don't we adjust our expectations then? So if someone is suffering from depression, do we expect them to be the life of the party? Do we expect them to be highly sociable and happy to interact in large groups? No, we don't. If someone is supposedly suffering from narcissism, disorder, why don't we then say, hey, that's a struggle for them because it must be really bad because of all of the things that it does that is so debilitating for you and all of that. Why don't we then show more sympathy and empathy and compassion and support for them so that we can help them to cope with their narcissistic disorder? We don't do that, right? Because we frame ourselves as victims. And just before someone takes a dig at me or swipe at me again about this, I'm not for 1 second condoning the behavior of anyone that behaves in a narcissistic manner. There are lots of narcissistic kind of behaviors out there. And that again applies to both men and women of all ages, in all race groups, and all ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds and religious backgrounds. It doesn't choose because it is a universal experience of insecurity. But the point is that if we want to claim that it is a disorder, then we can't at the same time also hold the person accountable for it, in the same way that we don't hold the person accountable for their depression because we think that they need medication, or we think they need to be fixed, or we don't hold them responsible for how they respond to trauma after the fact because we empathize with the trauma. But when it comes to something like narcissistic disorder, or bipolar disorder is another one also that is also quite common, that causes people to behave badly towards others, not just towards themselves, then we have no empathy for that. So it's either an illness and they don't have control over it, and in which case we need to adjust our expectations and show empathy and sympathy and support for them so that we can help them to be more functional, or we recognize that these are just legitimate human experiences of many, many experiences that come together in a way that on the surface doesn't make sense. And if we start looking at it from that perspective, then we stand a chance of seeing the human, because there's a human struggling behind it. And I'm not, again, please, just because we try to create understanding doesn't mean we're condoning, defending, or justifying anyone's behavior. For example, someone that's depressed, behaving unkindly towards someone else for no reason whatsoever, that isn't justifiable. It's not defensible. You can understand why they're behaving that way, but it doesn't mean that you're okay with them behaving that way. So you push back. How you push back must be effective, must be constructive, mustn't create a new problem. Same thing with the bipolars and the narcissistic behaviors and things like that. How you push back has to be constructive. Otherwise, you're just feeding the cycle. Because here's the thing, if I present my defense mechanism, which is anger or rage, or being harsh or abrasive, if I present that as my defense mechanism because I'm already feeling attacked, I perceive an attack on my being, on my sense of significance in that setting, or whatever it is, and you attack my behavior, and you keep shutting down my behavior, all you're doing is you're validating my defense mechanism, because if that defense mechanism wasn't there, you would have been attacking me, not my behavior. We don't get that. We completely lose sight of that. There's a human struggling behind every bad behavior. There has to be an intervention to stop the behavior itself if it's harmful to others or to the person themselves. But that's not where we stop with our understanding of why. Because once we understand why they're behaving that way, and we work through our whatever it is that we can to assist them in how they got to that point, they'll self-correct. Because they won't feel insignificant anymore. They won't feel as if they're being attacked anymore. They'll feel understood. And you show me someone who feels understood while they're raging. It doesn't happen. We rage because we're demanding understanding, and we're demanding significance, and we're demanding visibility and all of that. So by the time we get to that point, and yes, again, so many caveats, just because I'm directing my rage at the person in front of me doesn't mean they're responsible for me feeling that way. That's how we project our past experiences on someone else, because it feels the same way. That's exactly why we have road rage. Road rage is not about the person on the road that cut you off or drove badly. Road rage is about the fact that the way they drove made you feel invisible, or made you feel insignificant, or taken for granted, or abused. Your rights were abused on the road. And that resonates strongly with how much you feel those emotions in other spaces in your life, either at work or at home, or both. And it's because of that in that moment on the road, when someone does that, you just, enough is enough, and you just go for them. Because that's what road rage is about. It's about finally venting, because in the other spaces, if you had to vent like that, if you had to let loose like that, there would be consequences that you don't want. again, the fact that we can regulate our rage in different situations for the same thing proves that that is our communication. That is what we want the world to see about us. And the less people see us, even when we're raging and they write it down to just, you've got anger issues and you've got this issues and you've got that issues, we just have even more reason to feel enraged about the fact that nothing is ever enough to get them to understand. Sometimes we walk away, sometimes we become destructive, horribly destructive. And that's the sad part. It's because the human has been left to be invisible for too long. And unfortunately, that visibility is needed primarily by our parents. We need to feel visible to our parents first. But when we reach the age of self-awareness and understanding, we then need to start seeing our parents as the flawed humans that they were, so that we understand that that's not what they did because of who we are or what they thought of us. It's because of what demons they were struggling with that prevented them from being able to come and show up for us in a way that was healthier than that or more kinder than that. We lack understanding as humans because we don't see each other as human anymore. We only see each other as a bunch of symptoms and a bunch of rights and responsibilities and entitlements. And as long as we keep doing that, this world is going to get worse. We're going to be debating horrible things that should never be debated because it's so obvious that it's wrong. But we'll do it because in some distorted way, we found a way to explain why it has to be understood in that context because of all sorts of fancy things. Where do we stop? I don't know. So, let's see where we go to from here. But hopefully, if you can start recognizing your rage, if you start recognizing how it is that you feel about yourself, rather than always assuming that someone is making you feel that way, that's one massive step closer to claiming your agency and taking control of your life so that you can do something more purposeful with it rather than always reacting to what it is that you need from others and that others need from you. We need to do better than this. This is not about me raging against the system or against mainstream mental health or anything. I'm just identifying a troubling trend that we've got in this space where we interact with each other as humans and there's not much humanness and humanity left in our interactions. And this goes all the way from blood ties to partnerships and companionships and relationships and marriage and parenting, all the way through to our social interactions. Everything has this veneer of properness about it, and as long as everyone subscribes to that, we're okay. But the moment someone is human and they veer off that way of wanting to interact, suddenly we just become intolerant and we lack understanding and we give up on empathy. I hope there's something in there that you find will give you reason for pause and reflection and course correction, recalibration in how it is that you're approaching life. Because unless you do, you're going to keep waiting and needing and raging for others to show up the way you need them to before you actually find peace in your own life. And peace is so elusive these days. So give yourself a fighting chance, and I don't mean that in a fighting way. Give yourself a chance, a good chance of actually achieving some level of peace in your lifetime by realizing how much of what it is that you are worked up about, or how much it is that what it is that drives you to be enraged, how much of that is because of you having given up your agency, your perception of yourself, your expectations. You've given up on that and you've been driven completely by what it is that you need from others and how you interpret your value based on what others do to you. That's what we need to connect with. And hopefully when we start connecting with that, that will shift things for us, which in turn will shift things with the people around us because, and this is an absolutely important point, if you want to break the cycle you're in with the people around you, you don't wait for them to change. You change what you are contributing to that cycle so that they have something different to work with, which means automatically they will change. They have to, because they're not dealing with who you were yesterday. But you have to take that step. You have to want that for yourself. You have to want to be that person rather than be who you think they deserve you to be. And that's right there. That's the point of claiming agency. Be who you want to be, not who you have to be. Take care.